Hello, let's set the course for science instruction aligned to next generation science standards for students with intellectual disability. It's important to become familiar with the standards, their intent, and the research-based strategies for teaching science. We'll now review the research to learn more about what we already know about teaching science to students with intellectual disability. In 2007, Cortade and colleagues wanted to know more about what type of research has already been conducted on teaching science to students with significant disabilities. From this graph, you can see that they didn't find a lot. Actually, only 11 studies were located. They specifically outlined their review around the 7 content standards aligned or outlined by the NSES, the National Science Education Standards. And you see those listed as A, B, C, D, E, F, and G right here. This review was important because it demonstrated a big hole in the research to support teachers in how to teach science, especially inquiry, which is a big focus of all science learning. In 2011, Spooner and his colleagues at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte re-evaluated the literature in science. In collaboration with a science expert, they set really high expectations for what would be considered science, such as goals aligned to science standards. They found several more studies, and actually, they didn't include many of the studies that Cortade et al. Had found. They wanted to specifically look at what strategies were successful for teaching science to students with disabilities. They ended up finding 17 studies and found that 14 of them involved high-quality research. That high quality was deemed based on standards for single-subject research. Of those 14 studies, they found the use of systematic instruction, specifically time delay and task analytic instruction, were evidence-based practices. This is very important to note because No Child Left Behind requires the use of research and evidence-based practices to serve all students. Now that we've briefly reviewed the research for teaching science to students with significant disabilities, we need to get familiar with the new science standards introduced in 2013. Until recently, the NSES, the National Science Education Standards, guided science state standards. But with the new addition of the Common Core state standards, an opportunity has arisen to investigate science education. From this movement, the K-12 framework and next generation science standards were developed. The framework really digs deep into the practices of science, cross-cutting concepts, and core ideas that all students should develop throughout their science education. Note, there is a link to the standards on this slide. You may want to take some time either now or possibly later to look at these documents and how they're outlined. Coming back later may be a good idea as well after this module has given you some basic ideas for teaching science and as you become more familiar with how science is outlined. It'd be very difficult for special education teachers to teach within the framework if they're not familiar with the standards. The National Research Council developed the framework to really redefine science education and set a new vision for science for all. The main principle of the framework was really to attack past practices, such as teaching science in a format of reading passages or just learning vocabulary. New dimensions of how science as practice were outlined. We're going to review them now, starting on the next slide. These 3 dimensions were outlined by the K-12 framework and include science and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts, and disciplinary core ideas, such as life cycles or interdependency within the life cycles. So now let's take a minute so we can review each one of these dimensions individually. Science and engineering practices really encompass the problem-solving, that wonder aspect of science. Read through these 8 practices that all students should engage with. I'll give you just a second to do that. Okay, now that you've read through those 8 points, What does it sound like to you? What does this look like? Yes, you're right. It's inquiry. Inquiry is more than just a way science is taught, more than just an experiment on a table or a teacher bringing intangible materials for students to touch. It's science. Inquiry practices build over time, but they're truly the essence of science learning. Here's a table created by the National Research Council outlining inquiry learning. If you look, you'll see the essential features of inquiry listed down the left-hand column, and the variations in the 4 columns to the right of each one of those features. Those variations are important to note as you think about how or what the features may actually look like, especially for students with disabilities. There's a huge continuum of how students will engage and build their own inquiry skills over time. It's fine for a student to engage in questioning that their teacher provides. But over time, and as a student grows older, it's also important to build that questioning and self-initiated learning, hence, problem solving. All students can do this. All students can engage in inquiry of science. It just depends on how the teacher developed the opportunities and the learning within the classroom and environment. Cross-cutting concepts is the next of the 3 principles in the new K-12 framework for the next generation standards. These are the main ideas that encompass all science understanding and are generalizable across multiple standards and core ideas. For example, structure and function can be illustrated within the solar system, the body structure, or the structure of a cell. As students build understanding of these concepts within science, they're able to dive deeper into the standards. For some students, it may be important to highlight these while teaching and focus on concepts within these big ideas. Look for meaning, for generalization from one lesson to the next. For example, remember Jeffrey? Maybe it would be appropriate for him to identify similarities across multiple standards, such as part of a cell and it has a purpose, a function. There's a reason for it. Such as the membrane, the cell membrane and how it protects the inside of the cell. And then another lesson or another unit, maybe we'd start to look for that similarity, such as skin cells also protect the inside of the body. That's part of their function. Finally, the 3rd dimension is the core ideas of science. Similar to the Common Core State Standards, focus of instruction should be on the big ideas of science. Within the standards, emphasis is given to the core ideas of the standard. Objectives are written to outline those standards, with clarifying statements given that allow educators to really know what the focus of instruction surrounds. This core idea is the broad importance across the multiple science or engineering disciplines. It provides a tool for understanding and investigating these more complex ideas and problem solving. These core ideas are what relates to the interests and life experiences of the students so that they can link it to their personal life and make connections. This is what increases in depth over time and over grade levels. These core ideas. Let's review what those core ideas are focused on within the next slide. We're going to talk about this. These core ideas are built into the disciplinary core ideas of science. These are the same core ideas that have been taught for years within science, but now more than ever, focus is being placed on how to build these conceptual understanding of these disciplinary core ideas and to teach students to do science, to experience science within these core ideas. Only one more slide to go, and then we're going to return to the module. The Next Generation Science Standards is a document that refines and clarifies scientific inquiry by defining a set of 8 science and engineering practices. The shift from describing the teaching and learning of science as scientific inquiry is now made to engagement in scientific and engineering practices. This accomplishes multiple goals. First, learning as practice, physical and social engagement, time to do this within the lessons and through generalization. The next goal is sense making and language use, as students build the problem solving and making the connections and using the language to describe what they're seeing and doing. And third, to build curiosity and motivation to learn. Later in this module, a format using evidence-based science strategies for this population and a link to these 8 practices will be outlined to provide you with a model for teaching science to all students. Let's return to the module now.